There are places built to remind you that you don't belong, that you came from far away, that your name sounds different within these ancient walls, that the floor was made for other feet and not your own. But then she turns and looks at you across the room, and the Bronx girl forgets everything she knew about her place. My name is Maya Reeves, and this is the story of how I learned that some places can be beautiful and dangerous at the same time. I grew up in the Bronx, not the gentrified Bronx that shows up in Manhattan lifestyle magazines with artisanal coffee shops and colorful murals that cost more than 2 months of my family's rent. The real Bronx, the one with leaking ceilings at the Grand Concourse subway station, the one with bodegas that close at 11, the one with block parties in the summer because the apartments get too hot to sleep in, and air conditioning is a luxury you decide to buy once the kids are grown. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment that my mother, Denise Reeves, shared with me and my grandmother Grace, who everyone called Grandma G, and who even at 82 years old could look at you in a way that made you feel guilty even when you hadn't done anything wrong. My mother worked as a nursing technician at Lincoln Hospital. She pulled double shifts on Wednesdays and Fridays when she could, and used the extra money to pay tuition at St. Catherine's Academy on 149th Street, where I went to high school. It wasn't an elite school, but it was much better than the public alternative, and it had an English teacher named Mrs. Morrison who gave me a copy of Beloved at the end of my sophomore year and said, "You think differently, Maya. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I didn't. I studied like my life depended on it, because it did, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, with no motivational speeches and no scenes of revelation in the rain. In a much more ordinary and much more real way, I studied because the alternative was staying. And staying, for my neighborhood, for my block, for the specific context where I was born, meant a series of possible futures that I had seen close enough to recognize. Not that those futures were bad in themselves. My mother had one of those futures, and she was the strongest woman I knew. But I had the feeling, since I was 12 years old, that there was something out there that was specifically mine, and that I needed to go find it. The Harwick University scholarship arrived in a white envelope with a gold crest in the upper left corner. Full scholarship. Housing included, activity fees included, health insurance included. My mother dropped to one knee in the middle of the kitchen when I read it out loud. I had to hold the paper with both hands because they were shaking too much. Grandma G stayed in the same position in her chair by the window, looking out at the street, and said without turning around, "Of course it was. What do you think I've been praying for all these years?" Harwick University, Cambridge, Massachusetts, founded in 1764, consistently ranked among the top 5 universities in the country. A $42 billion endowment, 23 American presidents among its alumni, an acceptance rate of 6.8%, and me, Maya Reeves, from the Bronx, daughter of Denise, granddaughter of Grace, student at St. Catherine's Academy. I was going to walk through that door. I was the first person in my family to attend a 4-year college. I don't say that for self-pity. I say it because it shaped every decision I made in those first months at Harwick, and because it explains a lot about the woman I was when I arrived there, and about who I became afterward. September in Harwick smells like old money. That's not a metaphor. It is literally the smell of the place, wood treated with linseed oil varnish, imported perfume that lingers in the hallways like a ghost of possession, and that specific quality of cold Cambridge air in autumn that only exists when no one around you has ever had to worry about heating in winter. I learned to identify that smell in the first week. I also learned not to comment on it. The campus was absurdly beautiful. I knew it would be. I had researched before coming, seen photos on the institutional website, watched virtual tour videos during the summer while working afternoon shifts at the cafeteria where I'd been employed since junior year. But knowing a place is beautiful in photos, and then walking through it with the leaves beginning to turn red and gold, the sun hitting the brick and gray stone facades, is a completely different experience. It was beautiful in a way that made me want to stay and leave at the same time. Because beauty like that, built and maintained over centuries with money that has a name and a surname and a history, is also a declaration of ownership. The trees, the lawns, the neo-Gothic buildings with their arched windows and high ceilings, all of it had been built to say something. And part of what it said was, "This belongs to someone, and you know who." My roommate's name was Priya Chakrabarti. She was already in the room when I arrived. Her parents had helped set up her side, and there was a small Persian rug under her bed, a set of picture frames with photos of a clearly close and clearly comfortable family, and an electric diffuser that smelled like roses and sandalwood and probably cost more than my cell phone. Priya smiled when I walked in, stood up, extended her hand. Priya Chakrabarti, Connecticut. Maya Reeves, Bronx. There was a millisecond. I had trained my eyes to notice those milliseconds where she processed the information. Not with cruelty, without explicit judgment. She just processed it. And then the smile came back, complete, and she said, "I hope I'm not insufferable to share a room with." I tossed my backpack onto the empty bed and said, "I hope I'm not either." Priya laughed. It was genuine. She was genuine in a way that isn't necessarily common in people with money, and which caught me off guard enough for me to decide, that first day, that I could like her, which didn't mean I was going to lower my guard. I had arrived at Harwick with a set of rules I had formulated over the summer during the nights when I was too awake to sleep. Simple, unwritten but real. 1. Don't explain where you're from unless someone asks directly. 2. Don't apologize for existing in spaces where you weren't expected. 3. Don't let the beauty of the place make you forget you don't own it. 4. Study harder than anyone around you thinks is necessary. 5. Don't fall in love with anyone at Harwick. The 5th rule was the most important. The welcome reception was on Thursday of the first week in Whitmore Hall, enormous, with a ceiling of frescoes representing allegories of knowledge, virtue, and progress, painted in 1887 by an artist whose name I learned later, and immediately forgot because it wasn't relevant to anything I needed to know at that moment. Priya left a printed invitation on my bed before she left. "It's the first week," she said, applying something that smelled like roses. "I know. I have calculus to review." She looked at me through the mirror and said, "Maya, you don't have to be afraid." "I'm not afraid." She didn't say anything else. But the invitation stayed on the bed. I went because my mother told me, the night before my departure, with her hands on my face and her eyes full of something she never calls fear, but that I always knew it was. Go to everything, Maya. Don't let any door stay closed by your own choice. I went because Grandma G taught me that refusing the world before it refuses you is the most expensive form of pride that exists. I went because I was 18 years old and I was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there was a party in the most beautiful hall I had ever walked into. So I went. The hall was packed, maybe 300 students, maybe more, in a fog of overlapping perfumes and overlapping conversations, and that specific sound of many intelligent and anxious people trying to look like they aren't anxious. There were tables with appetizers I didn't all recognize, waiters circulating with trays of cold cider and red wine, and a string quartet playing in one corner. Discreetly, but there, because at Harwick even the background music is a statement of status. I grabbed a glass of cider and stayed by the window. Observing is a skill I developed early, not from shyness. I was never shy, but because observing before acting is a survival competency that certain people learn in a way that others don't need to. You read the room, you identify the exits, who's with whom, who has power and who's trying to look like they do. You map before you enter. So I stood by the window and mapped the room, and that was how I saw her for the first time. She was in the center of the room, not because she was doing anything dramatic. She was in a group of 4 or 5 people, with a glass in her hand talking. But there was something in the way the space around her organized itself. The other people angled slightly toward her, their bodies oriented like plants toward sunlight. That said, in a way that needed no words, "This is the person who matters here." tall. Blonde hair pinned up in a way that looked careless, and I knew, even from across the room, wasn't. It was the kind of carelessness that requires practice and awareness and probably 45 minutes in front of a mirror. A dark forest green blazer that matched the oak paneling on the walls as if it had been chosen specifically for this setting, which, I would realize later, it probably had been. A posture you only learn in certain environments, not rigid, not military, but that specific thing about people who grew up knowing a whole room might be watching them at any moment. She was laughing at something a guy in a tie said. The laugh didn't reach her eyes. I noticed that. I stood by the window and noticed that the laugh was beautiful and complete and didn't reach her eyes, and something in me registered that detail as important information without my knowing yet why. That's Sloane Whitfield. Priya appeared at my side with 2 glasses of cider. She'd grabbed a second one for me without asking, which would have felt condescending from other people, but from Priya seemed simply attentive. Daughter of Senator Whitfield, she continued, in a low tone, not gossip but information. From the Whitfield family of Boston, 3rd generation at Harwick. Her grandfather donated the name to the Political Science Building. Her mother founded the Women's Leadership Symposium. She's been student council president since sophomore year, which technically isn't permitted, but apparently they changed the rule. She's on the admissions committee, on the ethics forum of the law school, and about to be announced as commencement speaker, even though she's still a junior. I looked at Priya. You researched everyone before coming? Everyone relevant, she said, without any embarrassment. You didn't? I had, but not as methodically. Priya had approached the transition to university with the same energy I imagine she applied to research projects. Good for her, I said, returning my gaze to the center of the room. The context was irrelevant. I knew what Sloane Whitfield was before Priya told me. I had seen versions of her in every kind of space I had ever had access to. Not exactly the same, but recognizable. The person who embodies the institution, who was made by the institution and remakes it every time she walks into a room. I learned early not to waste energy on that. So I looked away, which was exactly when she looked in my direction. It wasn't a long look. 3 seconds maybe. 4, at most. The kind of duration that could be completely accidental, the result of an eye drifting across the room with no particular destination. There was no particular reason for it not to be accidental. But it wasn't accidental. I had been trained to recognize the difference. 3 vacant seconds are different from 3 seconds that land, that identify, that do something with the information they find. Sloane Whitfield's gaze landed on me long enough for me to be certain there was recognition in it, not of someone known, because we had never seen each other before. But the kind of recognition that asks who are you and why are you in this room without words. Then she went back to the guy with the tie. I looked away. I took a sip of cider. I mentally calculated the minimum socially acceptable time before I could leave. What unsettled me wasn't the look itself. It was the perfume. She was on the other side of the room, 12, 15 feet away at minimum. And even so, in that specific moment, I smelled her perfume as if she were much closer. Sandalwood, I recognized that immediately, and something citrusy underneath, bergamot maybe, and something else I couldn't identify but that I registered anyway, involuntarily. Too subtle to be an accident. Perfumes like that are chosen. I forced myself to look away. The real problem started when there were 7 minutes left. I was plotting the most discreet route to the door when a group walked past me laughing loudly, and I stepped 1 pace to the right without looking, and someone's elbow hit my arm, and the glass I was holding left my hand in a slow, inevitable arc. Red wine on a dark forest green blazer. Time stopped in a way that isn't poetic. It's horrible. That silence that expands in waves from a central point of social catastrophe. And the central point was me, with my hand still in the position of someone who had been holding a glass that no longer existed, and a crimson stain spreading across the fabric like an accusation. I looked at the stain. I looked up. Sloane Whitfield was a foot away from me, looking at the stain with an expression I couldn't read immediately, because there were too many layers and I was too stunned to process them. "Oh my God," I said. My voice came out louder than I meant it to. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see you. I didn't realize you were—" "It's fine." Her voice was neutral, controlled in the way voices get when a person is used to not letting emotions surface in their tone. She looked at the stain, assessing the damage, I realized, in a clinical way that impressed me, and then looked at me. Not down at me, which I expected, directly at me. Blue-green eyes, exactly the color I would have chosen if I were creating a character like this, which annoyed me more than it should have. "Accidents happen," she said. There was something almost rehearsed about the phrase. Not cruel, just efficient. The socially correct response given by someone trained to give correct responses in inconvenient situations. But then, the friend beside her, also blonde, shorter, with a smile too sharp at the corners, said, in a tone low enough to be calculatedly cruel and loud enough to be heard. Typical, one word, two weights. I felt the heat rise up my neck, across my face to my ears, not only from embarrassment, from anger. That specific anger that comes when someone reduces an accident to a category, when a spilled glass becomes evidence of a verdict that had already been handed down before you walked into the room. Sloane said nothing. She didn't defend me, didn't reprimand. She stayed there with her eyes on me, her expression neutral, while I stood with empty hands and a burning face. "I'll pay for the dry cleaning," I said. The voice came out steady. I don't know where that steadiness came from, probably from Grandma G, who taught me that the only thing you have complete control over in this world is the quality of your voice when everything is falling apart. "You don't have to," Sloane said. "I know I don't have to." I took a step back, deliberately creating distance. I'm offering." Silence. In that silence, which lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4, maybe an eternity, something happened in Sloane Whitfield's face that I couldn't name right away. It wasn't embarrassment, it wasn't irritation. It was something more subtle, more internal, as if a question had appeared behind her eyes and she didn't yet know what it was. "Sloane," the friend touched her arm, firm, possessive, the touch of someone exercising a right. "Come on. The presentation starts in 2 minutes." Sloane looked at me for one more moment. Then she left. Priya appeared with napkins and an expression that clearly said, "I should have left you in the room." "I saw," she said gently. "I know you saw." The one who commented was Bex Harrison, Elizabeth Harrison. She and Sloane have been friends since childhood. They grew up together in Beacon Hill. "Priya, yes? I don't need the biography of either of them." She paused, nodded, returned the stained napkins to the decorative table with a naturalness that almost made me laugh. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine. I wasn't fine." My face was still burning. My hands had that inconsistent feeling of something still passing through the system. But "I'm fine" wasn't a lie. It was a choice. The distinction between the two matters more than it seems. I left 7 minutes before I was supposed to. That night, I lay in bed listening to Priya breathe on her side of the room. She slept with the lightness of someone who had never had reason to be vigilantly alert, and I stared up at the brick ceiling. I wasn't angry. Anger requires surprise, and I wasn't surprised. I was the Bronx girl who spilled wine on the heiress. It was exactly the kind of story this place knew how to tell about people like me. The accident that becomes a metaphor. The involuntary gesture that becomes proof of a thesis that already existed before you arrived. I had read enough, lived enough, paid enough attention to know that spaces like this have their own grammar, and that in that grammar certain people are subjects and certain people are objects. I wasn't surprised. I was tired in a way that wasn't physical. What unsettled me, when I was honest with myself in the dark of the room, wasn't the friend with the sharp smile and the calculated word, wasn't the stain on the expensive blazer, or Sloane's silence, or the collective embarrassment of a whole room watching. It was the look. Before the wine, when she was on the other side of the room and looked at me for 3 or 4 seconds that weren't vacant. And afterward, after everything, that moment of silence when something happened in her face that I couldn't name. I spent too long thinking about it, more than the situation deserved, more than was reasonable, more than was safe. And then I forced myself to stop, because I had the rules, and the 5th rule was the most important, and the 5th rule said, don't fall in love with anyone at Harwick. The 5th rule said nothing about not lying awake thinking about a look. Technically. September turned to October without ceremony. The beauty of the campus escalated with the leaves. Red, gold, orange, that New England autumn palette that shows up on postcards and that is real, genuinely exists, and still feels unreal when you're inside it. I walked along the stone paths between buildings and sometimes had to force myself not to look at the horizon because there was too much beauty, and I couldn't afford to stand there staring. I had a schedule. Classes Monday through Friday. Calculus 1, Introduction to Economic Theory, American History. Since 1865, Argumentative Composition, and an elective seminar called Power, Institutions, and Inequality, that I had chosen because the syllabus interested me, and which I discovered in the first class was taught by the most intimidating professor I had ever encountered in my life, Dr. Ellison Carter, early 60s, Harwick through and through, specialist in power structures in liberal democracies, with the habit of calling students by their last name and asking questions that had no right answer. In the 3rd class, he called me Reeves for the first time and asked, "What do you think Tocqueville meant when he wrote that the tyranny of the majority is more formidable than any other form of tyranny?" I said what I thought Tocqueville meant, and then I said what I myself thought about it, which was different, and why. Dr. Carter looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Continue." I saw Sloane Whitfield around campus. It was inevitable. Harwick was large but not infinite, and Sloane was everywhere in the way that people in certain positions are. Not intrusive, but present. A background constant that you learn to register and file. There were posters with her name on information boards. The campus newspaper published her statements on internal policies with the regularity of an official announcement. In the 2nd week, I saw her give a presentation in the central courtyard about a new inclusion scholarship program she had helped create. There was a microphone, students in a semicircle, that posture and that voice and that thing she did with her hands when she spoke, keeping her palms slightly open, as if she were offering something. I didn't stop to listen. I kept walking, but I heard enough to notice that she knew exactly what she was doing with that voice. She knew how to use the weight of pauses, the rhythm of phrases, the precise moment when you lower your tone to make an audience lean slightly forward. It was a technical skill I recognized and respected regardless of how I felt about who possessed it. In the 3rd week, I saw her in the library. I was at my favorite spot on the 3rd floor, a table near the windows overlooking the back garden, when I smelled the perfume, sandalwood, bergamot, that thing I couldn't name. I didn't lift my head right away. I finished the paragraph I was reading about the distribution of political capital in democracies with universal suffrage, which in retrospect was ironically appropriate, and then looked up. Sloane Whitfield was 3 tables to my left, her back to me, opening her laptop with that efficiency of movement I had noticed in her, a precision that I couldn't tell was natural or learned. She hadn't seen me. I went back to the text. 15 minutes later, I needed to get a book from the reference shelf, which was on her side of the floor. I could have gone the long way. I went the direct route. When I passed her table, she looked up. Our eyes met. 2 seconds. 3. Neither of us said anything. I kept walking. I got the book. I came back the long way. "You're avoiding her," Priya said one Sunday night, when we were both doing readings and I had just closed my laptop with more force than necessary after finding a photo of Sloane on the campus newspaper website. I'm not avoiding anyone, Maya. Priya. She dog-eared the page of her book and looked at me over the top of it. What happened at that party wasn't your fault? I know. And what Beck said was terrible. I know. And the fact that you check the campus newspaper feed every night like it's an academic obligation. I don't check. Maya. She lowered the book. I live with you. I know what you do at 11 at night. Silence. I'm not giving any importance to this, I said eventually. I'm processing a new social context. It's different. Absolutely. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. Very different. Priya. Yes? No. I didn't say anything. You were about to. I was about to mention that the Student Council Mentorship Program opens applications next week, she said with an innocence far too excessive to be convincing. Valuable resource for first-year scholarship students. Monthly meeting with a senior council member. Who runs the mentorship program? The Student Council President, she said. Sloane Whitfield. No. Just an observation. No. Noted. She raised her book again. I just think avoiding isn't the same thing as being okay. I didn't respond. But that night, when Priya was asleep, I lay staring at the brick ceiling long enough to accept that she was right about one thing. I was avoiding. And the part that unsettled me was that I wasn't avoiding, because Sloane Whitfield intimidated me. I was avoiding because I wasn't angry. And I should have been. In the 4th week, on a Wednesday afternoon, I was in the cafeteria line when I heard her voice, not the presentation voice, the private one, lower, with an inflection of irritation she was clearly working to contain. She was on the phone, a few steps behind me in line, slightly to the side, her free hand holding her tray with that characteristic precision. I understand what you're saying, she said, in the tone of someone who understands nothing and is saying the opposite out of necessity. But I've already told you I can't be there this weekend. I have the ethics forum. A pause. It's not about wanting or not wanting. And there was something different now, something she wasn't containing as well. A layer of exhaustion beneath the control. It's about commitments I made and that... Another pause, longer. She closed her eyes for a moment. I saw that in profile, her eyelids coming down, her jaw slightly tight. That thing the human face does when processing something that tires in a way that isn't physical. Yes, she said finally. I'll see what I can do. She hung up. She stood still for 2 seconds with the phone in her hand, staring at nothing in front of her. Then the line moved, she moved with it, and when her eyes came back into focus, she saw me. I was looking. I shouldn't have been looking. Something passed across her face, recognition first, and then something else I couldn't identify, but different from the times before. Reeves, she said. I blinked. She knew my name. That was unexpected. And the fact that it was unexpected was itself information I would need to process later. Whitfield, I said. The corner of her mouth moved, not a smile, the shadow of a smile, the indication that a smile had been considered and filed away. You survived the first few weeks, she said. Looks like it. Professor Davies's calculus course usually claims a victim a week. I'm good at calculus. Good, she said, and there was something in the tone that I still couldn't categorize. You're going to need to be. The line moved again. I took my tray. She took hers. And then someone called her name from across the cafeteria. Bex Harrison. I recognized the voice before I turned my face, and Sloane moved toward the voice without looking back. I found a table near the windows. I spent the entire lunch pretending to read my economic theory notes while thinking about the fact that she knew my name. And that I didn't know how she knew my name, and that the exhaustion I had seen in that face for a moment wasn't the kind of thing the official student council photograph showed. Sloane Whitfield was student council president and a senator's daughter and third generation at Harwick, and her laugh didn't reach her eyes, and she knew my name. I shouldn't have been thinking about it. The fifth rule was the most important, but I kept thinking about it anyway. In the fifth week, there was a student assembly. Assemblies were biannual, mandatory for all enrolled students, and took place in the large auditorium of the main hall. I went because it was mandatory and because I took obligations seriously. Sloane Whitfield ran the assembly. I knew she would. It was in the program. But knowing and seeing are different things. And seeing Sloane at the podium of an auditorium with 200 students was different from any version of her I had encountered until then. She was good. Not merely competent, genuinely good. There was a quality to the way she ran things, an ability to turn bureaucratic procedure into something that sounded like real conversation, that I recognized as talent. She listened to questions completely before answering. She didn't pretend to agree when she disagreed. She said, "I understand the perspective and here's what I think," with a confidence that wasn't arrogant because it had substance underneath it. There was a sophomore student, tall, glasses, slightly aggressive tone, who stood up and asked a question about the student association budget, implying, with that specific kind of accusatory vagueness, that there were irregularities. Sloane heard him out, then said, with a precision that was almost surgical, "The full budget, with all line items, has been available on the student portal since March. If you look at page 16, you'll find the line you're questioning with a complete justification. If you still have questions after reading it, my office hours are Thursday from 3 to 5, and I'd be happy to talk it through." A 1-second pause. "Any other questions?" The student sat down. Someone in the row behind me whispered to their neighbor, "God, she's terrifying." The neighbor replied, "She's incredible." I wrote in my notebook, "Field authority without apparent aggression. Technique or nature." And then I crossed it out because it wasn't an academic note. After the assembly in the hallway outside, I was putting my notebook away when I heard Bex Harrison. She was with 2 other people I didn't know, her back to me, and the hallway had good acoustics. "It's not that I have anything against it," Bex was saying, with that tone of people who put that phrase before saying exactly the thing they have something against. "The inclusion program is nice on paper, but then you go to a reception and you can't even have a glass in your hand without someone." "Bex," said one of the others, "I'm just saying what everyone thinks." Not everyone thinks that. Everyone who matters. I stopped listening at that point, not because I couldn't hear anymore, because there was a choice to be made, and I chose to put my notebook in my bag, adjust the zipper, and walk down the hallway in the opposite direction. Grandma G taught me that there are battles you fight and battles you document. Not every provocation deserves your voice. Sometimes you save your voice for when it will actually make a difference. I saved it, but I also kept what I heard in a mental file I knew I would need later. That night, for the first time in 5 weeks, I called my mother in the middle of the week. She answered on the second ring with that quality that mothers' voices have for late-night calls from their children. Present, without alarm, but attentive. "Maya, is everything okay?" "Everything's fine." And this time it was more true than it had been. "I just wanted to talk to you." I heard her smile. Didn't see it, but heard it. The quality of the silence before she answered changed in a way I had learned to recognize when I was 7 years old. "Tell me," she said, so I told her. Not everything. Not the whole, not the wine, not the sandalwood perfume, not the look that wasn't vacant. But I told her about the campus in the fall, and Dr. Carter and Tocqueville, and Priya with her napkins and her mental database of notable student profiles, and the assembly and Sloane at the podium with her open hands. "She sounds interesting," my mother said. "She's a senator's daughter." That doesn't make her less interesting. Mom, I'm serious. The most interesting people I've ever known also had things that made them complicated. A pause. Including you? I laughed. The first time I had really laughed in weeks, and it was on the phone with my mother at 10:30 at night. How's Grandma G? The same. Better. You know how she is. She refuses decline with the same stubbornness she refuses help putting away the groceries. Said last week you should be studying Latin because the Romans understood power. She's not wrong. She never is. My mother laughed too. Maya, are you doing what I told you? I'm going to everything. That's not all I told you. A light pause. I told you not to let any door stay closed by your own choice, but I also told you, don't let the place change who you are. Do you remember the second part? I remember. Okay, then good night. Good night, Mom. She hung up. I sat on the bed with the phone in my hand, listening to Priya breathe. I thought about Sloane Whitfield with her open hands at the podium. I thought about the exhaustion I had seen in that face for a moment in the cafeteria line. I thought about the sandalwood and bergamot perfume arriving from across large rooms, and I thought about the fifth rule. Grandma G also taught me something that wasn't in the rules and that I hadn't put into words. But that was there, somewhere underneath everything, that protecting your heart is necessary, and that closing your heart is different, and that knowing the distinction between the two is one of the hardest things there is. I still didn't know which side of that line I was on. October ended with a storm, not metaphorical, literal. A fall storm that arrived on a Monday night and spent the next 3 hours testing the dormitory windows, and which stripped all the remaining leaves from the trees, so that when I went out the next morning the campus was bare in a way that was beautiful and slightly desolate, all those branches against the gray sky like exposed nerves. I ran anyway. The rain had stopped, but the air had that after-storm quality, heavy, clean, cold, in a way that entered the lungs with more awareness than usual. On the way back, on the path between the river and the dormitory, I passed the bronze plaque at the entrance of the Whitfield Sciences building. In honor of Charles Whitfield III, class of 1951, whose generosity and vision made this building and the future it represents possible. I stopped, read it again, and then kept walking, because I had just enough time to shower before argumentative composition, and because stopping in front of bronze plaques wasn't something I could afford to do for very long. But I thought, as I walked, what a strange thing it must be to have your name on a building, to have inherited not just the money but the expectation of the name, the weight of generations of institutionalized presence, the obligation to be the face of something built long before you were born, and that will continue long after you are gone. What a strange thing it must be, I thought, to have no choice about who you are in a place, and then I immediately wondered if Sloane thought about that. And then I wondered why I was wondering what Sloane thought. And then I got to the dormitory and took the coldest shower my system could stand, as punishment for continuing to think about Sloane Whitfield at 6:45 in the morning on a Tuesday in November. 3 days later, in the library, at my spot on the third floor, someone pulled out the chair across from me without asking. I didn't look up right away. I finished the paragraph I was reading. I looked up. Sloane Whitfield had a thick book under her arm, a laptop, and an expression I still hadn't fully learned to read. Not the presentation expression. That was public, calibrated. I already knew how to recognize it. Something closer to what I had seen in the cafeteria line. Closer to the real face, if there was such a thing. You study here on Wednesdays, she said. Not a question. Yes. I needed a quiet spot too, she said, setting her things on the table with her usual efficiency. The table I normally use is taken. There was something slightly challenging in the way she did it, not hostile, but as if she were checking whether I would object, prepared to argue if I did. You can sit, I said. I already sat. I know. The corner of her mouth moved again, that shadow of a smile. She opened her laptop. I went back to the text. We worked in silence for 40 minutes. It wasn't the awkward silence of two people who need to fill the space and don't know how. It was the functional silence of two people doing things that required attention, who had arrived at a tacit understanding that the space was large enough to accommodate both sets of attention without collision. I hadn't expected it to be that kind of silence. At 10 minutes to 10, she closed her laptop, organized her things, stood up. "Reeves." I looked up. "You're in Dr. Carter's seminar," she said. Again, not a question. "Yes. He told me you have interesting perspectives on the distribution of power in liberal democracies. I didn't know what to do with that information." Dr. Carter had talked about my work with Sloan Whitfield. That was unexpected. And the fact that she was telling me was even more unexpected. "Dr. Carter talks to a lot of people," I said carefully. "He talks to very few people about students' work. I've known him for 3 years. He's sparing with praise." Silence. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. She looked at me for a moment. That look that processes before responding, which I was learning to recognize as characteristic of her. "Good night, Reeves," she said. And she left. I stared at the space where she had been, then at my cold coffee, then at the text on page 68. I didn't finish another equation that night. Priya was awake when I got back. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing." A pause. "She spent 40 minutes studying at my table." Priya slowly lowered her book. "Who?" I looked at her. "Oh," said Priya. "No." I didn't say anything. "Sloan Whitfield has a permanent table in the library," Priya said with an innocence that had completely given up pretending to be convincing. "Everyone knows which one it is. She's been at that table every Wednesday since sophomore year." Silence. "So the table wasn't taken," I said. "Not as far as I know." I sat with that. "Why would she do that?" "Sometimes people do things because they want to," Priya said with that direct gentleness I had learned to expect from her. "There isn't always a strategic reason." "At Harwick there is." "At Harwick," she agreed. "But people are also people, even here." I lay down on the bed without changing, staring at the brick ceiling. "She said Dr. Carter had talked about my work," I said out loud, more to myself than to Priya. "And?" And then she said goodnight and left. Priya was quiet for a moment. "That's basically flirting in Harwick speak," she said eventually. "It's not. Maya." "Priya." "I'm going to sleep," she said, turning off her bedside lamp. "Oh? But just for the record, you clearly think about her more than you think about your calculus assignments, and you love calculus." The room went dark. I lay there. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I had that specific thing that has no good name in any language, that feeling of being on the edge of something, of looking down and not being able to see the bottom, without yet knowing whether the next step will be to step back or to jump. She had stayed for 40 minutes. She had known my name for longer than I thought. Her laugh didn't reach her eyes, but there was something else, in that corner of her mouth, that reached somewhere I hadn't mapped yet. The fifth rule was the most important, but the rules you need most are always the hardest to keep. And I discovered in the dark with Priya asleep beside me, genuinely afraid that this was the rule I was going to break first, which was different from being angry about it, and which was, in some way I still couldn't fully name, so much worse.